So let's start with a question. And that question is, what is UX? Well, UX is concerned with the creation of products that are useful, usable, and valuable. Now, they're useful to the user who wants to interact with your product, and they're also usable so that when they are interacting with your product, it's an enjoyable experience. It generates a positive emotional response. And also, the product must be valuable. And not only valuable to the user, but valuable to the organization who created the product in the first place. Another way of looking at UX is to look at it in terms of a simple equation. So UX can be seen as the sum of organizational goals plus user goals plus user interface plus interaction with the back-end system. All of that combined to create user experience. In particular, user experience in terms of web or software development. And while UX isn't strictly a science, there is a process and a structure behind generating the conditions for a positive user experience. The methodology or the process was first developed by Jesse James Garrett, and they're known as the 5 planes of user experience. And they are strategy, scope, structure, skeleton, and surface, with strategy being the most abstract and surface being the most concrete. So strategy represents the business goals, the idea, the initial idea, why you want to build a product in the first place. And the surface represents the finished product. So where does it sit, this process? Well, it's not just a step in the overall development of a product. It is the process that allows the product to get built in the first place. UX, and in particular, the 5 planes of UX, otherwise known as user-centered design, they must be present in all stages of a product's evolution, from its inception to the first time a user uses it in the real world or interacts with it in the real world. So it's an ongoing effort to learn about users and evolve our products, because a product is a living thing. There are too many competitors out there to rest on your laurels once you've built something. It's also not just limited to web design or development. And all project stakeholders contribute to user experience design. So let's look at the planes in more detail. So again, let's look at the strategy and move on up, bubble up to the surface. So the strategy is concerned with what are we aiming to achieve in the first place and for whom. When moving on up to the scope plane, we then ask the question, what features, based on the information from the strategy, in other words, what based on our business goals and our objectives and the idea and the reason behind the product's existence, well, what features do we want to include in our design? What's on the table and what's not, at least for now. Remember, you can go live with what's called a minimal viable product, an MVP. And a minimal viable product will contain the essential features that allow the thing that you're building to function. You may have desirable features that you really want to put in there, but you may not have the time, the skill set, or the resources to do it at that particular stage. So moving then from the scope to the structure, you then start thinking about, well, how's our information structured? How is it logically grouped? The features, the elements, the data, the information. Remember, a user is only visiting your site for some kind of content. They're looking for some kind of content. And beyond the structure, we have the skeleton. Things are getting more defined now. We're starting to create mock-ups, whether they're on paper or using tools to create prototypes. So it's concerned with how the information should be implemented. How will the user navigate through the information and the features? How will the content relate to each other? What relationships will the content have? What has priority? What has top priority? What has lower priority? And based on those priorities, where do we position the content? And how do we navigate to those higher and lower priorities? And finally, at the level of the surface, we ask the question, what will the product actually look like? What colors? What typography are we going to put in place? What images? What design elements? What animations, if any? What transitions? What other effects are going to be in place? In other words, what will the final product look like?